All right, welcome back live at Drew's house here. Another edition. Hope everybody is doing well. We have another music show to end the week. Always exciting. My favorite way to end the week. Although it's kind of been a tough week here so far. We'll talk about that in a moment. But again, thanks everybody for joining us. Another edition. It's been a fun week, and hope everybody's doing okay through the pandemic. My guest is ready to rock, so let's get right to him. Tim English, music writer, joins us. And Tim, first of all, thanks for coming on the show. How are you, sir?
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Drew.
Just reminiscing about some Providence days. Your Providence
Yes.
school back in the day.
Yeah, good times.
I hear nothing's changed since you and I have both lived at Providence for college.
Yeah, well, maybe since you were there, there's a lot's changed since I've been there, I think.
I think a lot has since I have as well. But well, Tim, we got a lot to talk about. Let's start with obviously the sad news of we're hearing of Eddie Van Halen's death. A bit of a surprise to me. I don't know if it was to you, but not 2020 keeps hitting.
Yeah, 2020 has been a hell of a year in a lot of ways. Certainly the music world has lost so many great people. Eddie's death wasn't really a shock because I'd read, I think maybe a year ago or earlier in the year, that he was having some medical problems. There were reports that he sought treatment in Europe, and it's just too bad. He was only 65, and just one of the greats. When it comes to guitar, he just reinvented the wheel, didn't he? I mean, if imitation is the greatest form of flattery, he should be very flattered.
And, it's funny because so many guitar virtuosos are out there, but they don't become Van Halen and they don't become these massive groups. He had that extra intangible, and that's something that made him a rock star. What exactly was that something?
Well, he had great technique and he was extremely innovative. When you heard his tapping and you heard that first Van Halen album, I mean, it was really a step forward from what other people were doing at the time. And I just think, when I think of him, I think of Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys, and I'll tell you why. Because you've got a guy who's just a virtuoso, just one of the greatest in the world on these instruments, but he's surrounded by sort of these frat boy. Brian Wilson being the genius of the Beach Boys, Eddie being the genius of Van Halen. But he's surrounded by these sort of frat boy guys that are able to maybe translate that and relate regular people to it a little bit, So I don't know, it reminds me of that dynamic that you had in the Beach Boys. Genius on one hand, sort of frat boy party guys on the other hand. But it worked, didn't it?
It certainly did. What do you think made Van Halen such because I mean, it's a really cult following. I mean, obviously they have music that has stood the test of time, but I'm just looking through my Twitter timeline here, and people are just absolutely devastated and gutted about this loss for the music world.
Yeah, Van Halen is one of the bands that people are really interested in for whatever reason. I know I listened to a couple of people that are, sort of in that musical hard rock world, and they say that the fans, Van Halen and AC/DC are the two that people are always asking about. One of the, now of course, sadly, Van Halen will never get back together. It's over. But, there's just a lot of interest. I wouldn't say they're cults because they're, cult bands don't usually sell out multiple dates at Madison Square Garden on their reunion tours. But, they very popular and have stayed popular. And the music still sounds great, doesn't it? They're 40 years old. All those early, whatever it was, first 6 albums from the first one up to when David left and Sammy got there, it still sound good.
Absolutely. And just as we'll move on to the topic of the day in a second, which is your new book here about John Lennon coming out. But what 2020 is far, I mean, I can start listing the names and it's kind of pointless because I'll forget somebody, but all the music losses so far this year, whether some of it due to COVID, but some of it just timing during the pandemic, it's been a really tough year on the music industry.
Yeah, well, it's been a tough year all around, I guess, but music world has been really, really hard hit. We've lost so many people, Eddie Van Halen just being the latest. And I don't know, it makes you appreciate people, I guess. And, when you start getting on in years a little bit, you realize how precious your time is. And, there's no guarantee for anybody.
Well said. All right, Tim English. So the reason that we have booked you on the show, though, is you have a new book coming out about John Lennon, who would have been 80 years old. Absolutely unbelievable this week. First of all, that number, does it still kind of catch you off guard?
Well, as he would have turned 40 this week, and he died 40 years ago, so he's been gone now as long as he lived, and he's been gone much longer than people were aware of him than when he was famous. And you talk about somebody whose music has stood the test of time in a way. You know, the music of the Beatles, it might be more popular than it was when he died, which is hard to believe. I mean, you look at the albums that still sell the best. You look at streaming on Spotify. You got a group that hasn't played a note in 50 years that are still in the top 10 streamed groups. I mean, that's pretty mind blowing, you know. And I think part of it is demographic, that you had in the 60s. All these young people that were sort of coming of age at the same time, and created sort of a community together. And of course, John was part of that as a leader of it. So it was a very special time, and you can't do it again. When you been studying John's interviews for my book, which is John Lennon 1980 playlist, in 1980, they're still asking him, hey, when are the Beatles getting back together? Why don't you guys get back together? And, you know, John knew that, you know, it's like when you dip your hand in the river, you can only do it one time, right? And they said it would be pointless. You can never recreate those circumstances that brought them together, and never create the time where they were together. And, but the interviewers are sort of like grasping, like they knew something really big went down, but they're still, I think even in 1980, the impact that the Beatles had on the world as not only musical, but a cultural force, people didn't really quite get it yet. They're still trying to figure it out at that time, you know? And you can tell that in the questions that they would put to John at the time. And John would be like, well, you know, the idea was not, we weren't the reason for the whole thing, but the reason was to tell people, you know, what you can do with your own life, that there were more possibilities for your life than going to school, getting a job, and getting married, and that's it. You know, there were other options. And that was sort of what the whole idea was about. And he certainly followed that in the 70s. He turned off being a rock star, which was unheard of at the time. I start out the book talking about what his contemporaries did during those 5 years where John was gone, from 75 to 1980. Most of them put out an album a year. And so for somebody to just leave and not do anything for 5 or 6 years was just unheard of at that time. But he wanted to spend time with his son, Sean, who was born in 1975. He had not been around at all much for his first son. He went long periods without seeing his first son, Julian. So he wanted to change his life around, and he did. And by all accounts of the people that knew him in 1980, he was very contented with his life.
And of course, in songs as well, stepping away. I mean, I just, the top of my head, I think of, you know, watching the wheels go around. He's got that line about, you know, he's I forget the exact line's not coming to me, but he talks about how people looking at him strange. What are you doing? You're going to miss the big time, right? And it's he certainly wrote about it as well. It's a step away in the prime like that. I mean, I'm trying to think of a band bands have done that since. I wonder if they've looked back on the Beatles and kind of and looked back at the move of John Lennon and said, you know, it's an okay route to go, because I'm sure these major artists within these big bands feel that urge sometimes.
Now you see it more. You know, it's not that unusual for somebody to go 5 years, or they do a side project of some kind. But at that time, it was really unusual. You know, it was basically everybody would put out an album a year, including John. From the time of 1970, he put out an album a year for each of those years up through 75. So it was, to step away like that was really unusual. There were the two things that happened. It was the birth of his son, Sean, and also his contract with Capitol, which he'd been tied into since the Beatle days, expired in January of 1976. So the first time he wasn't obligated to be productive creatively, and he finally had his time to himself, and he took advantage of it. I think there was also a thing where, he was a little burnt out at the time too. If you listen to Mind Games in '73 or Walls and Bridges in '74, and John later admitted it sounded like the work of a depressed guy who's kind of turning it out. Does it have some great stuff on there? Yes, but you can tell the creative spark kind of needed to be lit again.
Tim English's new book here is John Lennon 1980 Playlist. Is that a play on the world we live in of Spotify and all this stuff here?
Yeah, I thought it was a catchy title because it's basically the songs that he was listening to then, and trying to. I talked to a lot of real diehard Beatlemaniacs, and they're like, I heard all this before. And I'm like, no, you haven't. You've heard some of it before, but no, they've got a lot of surprises for those people, and also for the casual fan, fill in a lot of stuff that they probably don't know. And I try to use the songs as sort of a jumping off point to make larger points about what was going on in John's life at the time. And there were songs that actually influenced his decision to go back in the studio. Later, John said that when he heard Queen's song, Crazy Little Thing Called Love, which was a hit, #1 hit in early 1980, that's a very un-Queen-like song, as you know. It's not the usual bombast that we get from Queen. It's like a rockabilly Elvis tune. And John heard that, and he says, wow, this is my time again, coming back to the music that I like. And then he heard Paul McCartney's Coming Up, and there are two different people that rode in a car with him when that song came on the air that said, wow, he was really taken with that, He said, oh, yeah, like he said his old bandmate was really doing great work again. And, the engine room of the Beatles was a songwriting competition between John and Paul, constantly trying to one-up each other and outdo each other. And so I think that, maybe made him say, okay, let me see what I can come up with. And I'll tell you what, if you listen to John's song, I'm Stepping Out, which is one of the first things he recorded when he got back in the studio, sounds a little bit like Coming Up. It even the music does, and the lyrically, where both songs say "you say you're gonna" or "you say you," they both have that same lyrical line. So I think there is definitely a connection there.
And that was a real thing. I mean, I've heard Paul McCartney talk about that in even recent years about how they definitely challenged each other, and it was, oh, okay, yeah, I see that, and I raise you this.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And it certainly worked, argue with the results, can you?
And then you have, this is a magical, obviously John Lennon's our topic, but, and then you have George Harrison back there, who's like maybe arguably, there are those who could make the case that he had maybe the best of the solo careers. He
certainly got off to the best start. Yeah, he did.
It's an amazing group of guys on their own individual terms when you really look at it.
Things about George Harrison, and I just found these out recently. The song And I Love Her, every arrangement of And I Love Her has do, 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 right? That guitar little figure at the beginning of it. George Harrison wrote that and contributed to the song and was never credited with it. He should have at least a little portion of that song if you come up with that, wouldn't you say? And Paul McCartney said that himself. Another thing, and We Can Work It Out, everybody always gives, I was just reading today where somebody was giving John credit for the way it sort of breaks into a waltz during the middle eight, where the life is very short lines, and I just found out recently that was George who came up with that idea, So I think his importance was underrated, that a lot of he really helped bring to fruition a lot of their musical ideas.
Absolutely. What, Tim English joining us again, what is I would imagine, and I've never written a book on the Beatles, but I would imagine it's a little bit kind of a gutsy move to go in that direction because they are a band that, of course, has been studied by so many people and no shortage of opinions. Music critics have dug into this. How did you attack your research on the actual book? And I guess what were you surprised by or learned? Kind of dive into that a little bit.
Well, I've written 3 books, and the most successful was also about music called Sounds Like Teen Spirit. And that was a book about songs that appear to have ripped off their melodies from earlier songs. And I had a lot about the Beatles, maybe I don't know, a quarter of the book may have been taken up with Beatles stuff. I'm so interested in it, and the readers were too. And trying to give people those sort of aha moments. So really, in coming up with an idea to write a book, you sort of write the book that you would like to read yourself, that nobody else has written. And if somebody else had written it, why would I bother? You know, there'd be no point. And writing a book of nonfiction, at least the ones that I write, it's all facts. Everything has to be checked out, double checked, constantly trying to discover new facts. And I like that. That's a turn on. If I was writing about, you know, the economics of wheat farming or something, I'd be suicidal, because it would be the most arduous work you could ever have. But when you're trying to find out something new, it's like, wow, yeah, I didn't know that. That makes it fun. So it's work, but it's fun. And that's what I try to do with the book is, you know, be informative as well as entertaining, and give people some stuff they haven't heard before. You asked, though, some of the things that surprised me. One thing that surprised me was that we know how this story ends, and sometimes you can look back on the run up to a particular era, like, you know, people look back at the summer of 2001 and the music and what was going on then before the big tragedy on 9/11. But there are 4 songs that John was involved with that year or wrote that really seem to, you know, maybe indicate mortality or impending doom, you know, which is, well, I wasn't really expecting that. I knew he had had the song written on Living on Borrowed Time, which was inspired by Bob Marley's song Hallelujah Time, which John heard in the summer in June when he was down in Bermuda. That was written by a woman, by the way, Jean Watt. It was not written by Bob Marley. It was written by the wife of Bunny Livingston. That song. Then he had a song called, what was it? Help me to help myself, where he talks about the angels of destruction, where I tried to stay alive, but the angel of destruction was by my side. And then there was another song called Gone from This Place that he was working on in 1980. And then, of course, in the last week of his life, he was working on Yoko's song, Walking on Thin Ice. It's a very modern sounding, innovative track, but, you know, just the title of it, it's sort of an eerie, foreboding song, Walking on Thin Ice. You know, we know what happens when you walk on thin ice. So, you know, I wasn't really expecting that there were so many little indications there that, you know, maybe something bad was in the offing.
We often, you know, he obviously removed himself and had to face tough questions from reporters, the press quite often. Was there a level of John Lennon that was just straight up uncomfortable with all the fame and didn't like it at times?
Yeah, from some of the accounts I read, he was very paranoid when he would see fans around, and, you know, maybe justifiably so. He would always be able to spot when he was recognized, when somebody recognized him, and it would get very uncomfortable. And when he saw that somebody recognized, it was always guys, by the way, almost always. He said the worst place for me to go was record stores. That's where all the Beatle freaks hang out. He said that's the last place he would have loved to have gone, but he couldn't go. He said that's where all the Beatle freak guys hang out. But he was very wary, I think, of being recognized. And like anybody, I think he said one time, once you know, it's like virginity. Once you lose your privacy or your anonymity was the word, I think. He said you can never get it back, you know. So, yeah, I think he was, you know, I think he enjoyed his privacy, but, you know, he was one of the most famous people in the world living smack in the middle of Manhattan. There's a limited amount of privacy you're going to get like that, I guess.
You know, all the digging you've done into him over the years, I wonder, 2020, this political climate, everything going on in the world. I made the comment to somebody just randomly today when I said, wow, 80 is coming up, would have been 80. And I think it kind of pisses me off a little bit because I think of all the lost years, and I think of so many of the great artists that I love and how so much of their work was done in the second half of their lives, and so much of their great work was done in the latter half of their careers. And I think, what did we miss out on?
We obviously missed out on a lot, but, you know, it's a miracle that somebody like this met up with another musical genius the way they did. I mean, if you want to take the odds and probability of those two guys getting together, I don't know what great artists you want to say that got together and put their heads together and made, there's a great interview up now where Sean Lennon interviews both Elton John, Julian Lennon, and Paul McCartney. And the Paul McCartney one is really touching to hear them talk and reminisce about things. And really, Paul telling Sean a lot of stuff about his dad that he didn't know, or certainly from a different perspective. But, it's like anything. It happened, and it's a long time ago now, and it was a terrible thing. But, we still have the music. When people would talk about the Beatles, he would go, why don't you go dig up Glenn Miller? What's the point? It's like our parents love Glenn Miller, all right, that was great at the time. You still have the records if you want to enjoy it, but we're not going to go digging them back up. He said people wanted to see it again, do it all again, because we missed it the first time. Didn't make any sense.
What does you mentioned that so much of John stepping away was to be a dad. How was he as a dad? Does Sean shed light onto that?
From what I understand, the first time around it was maybe an F. The second time around was maybe an A. I don't know. I think he probably had some guilt about being away, and then he had years where he didn't see his son Julian. And from what I understand, listening to interviews with Julian, he was going to regular public school. He wasn't living in the lap of luxury exactly. And but by all accounts, I think he did a better job the second time.
Absolutely. What did so I'm 33 years old, born in 1987. I obviously I have done my research, and I have a feeling for the impact of the actual night that he was shot. I think that I've done the whole Howard Cosell Monday Night Football thing, and that's how so much of the world learned. But if you're not there and living it and breathing it and just hearing that news, what's it like hearing that such an icon is just gone in that way?
It was as bad and as horrible as you would imagine it to be. It was one of the worst days or nights of my life. At that time in my life, I hadn't really lost anybody close to me, but I used to snicker, like when Princess Di died, and these people, they didn't even know her, and they're out there crying, and I was snickering along with everybody else. But I felt the same way when John Lennon died. It was a terrible. I don't know. You took it personally, I guess. And and it's not a perfect comparison, but I would compare it to 9/11. Not obviously on the human tragedy and death scale. It was only one death, not 2,800 or whatever it was. But the fact that it could happen and the fact that it did happen were both terrible things. And the guy is walking home to his house, and he's got a 5-year-old son, and I don't dwell on that in the book, but I kind of get into some of the interesting things going on around it. I did some research and found that Saturday Night Live had done a skit, quote unquote, a field skit, right before Double Fantasy came out. So it would have been around November 15th. And they sent their reporter outside the Dakota and talking about this is where John Lennon lives, and these are his fans and all that type of stuff. And when you look at it in retrospect of what happened, you're like, what the hell were they thinking with this? You know what I mean? But on the other hand, it was a different time. We live in a different time. It wasn't as all open as it was. I remember reading, seeing an interview with Paul McCartney. This was back in the 60s, but he said he met some guy on the street who said, I'm Jesus, I wanted to let you know I'm Jesus. And he said, okay, come on in, have a cup of tea with us. Yeah. And the interview was like shaking his head. You let the guy in your house? The guy was a kook? And Paul said, it was a different times. You got to remember, it was a different time.
Yeah. And he's obviously going. I've heard, I've seen stories with him where he, I think I have this right, but if somebody comes up to him for a photo or photos and autographs, I think he does one of them, but I think he definitely says no to photos, McCartney, and says, I'll have a quick conversation with you. We can talk, but let's stay away from taking the photos and all that.
Yeah. Well, I guess they try to be as nice as they can be, but it probably gets to be a pain in the neck after a while, I guess. But,
I'm sure it does. Where do you remember where were you on that night? Just my last question on that.
I was in my dorm room in Providence, and we got it listening to Howard Cosell on Monday Night Football, like a lot of other people did, and just devastating news. One of the things I get into in the book is how we just talked about how our world has changed. I mean, we didn't have a lot of the stuff you grew up with. We didn't have it back then. You're so lucky. We didn't even have fax machines in 1980. Yeah. But a TV would be, I believe we even had a black and white, it was like 5 channels, 6 channels to choose from. It was hard times.
Yeah.
You had to buy the record, you had to, or wait for the song to come on the radio. A lot of things have changed since 1980, which writing this book reminded me of. To me, it doesn't seem that long ago, but of course it is.
Absolutely. I mean, it is amazing how many people heard that from Monday Night Football. That's what everybody was watching that night, and that is how the news was delivered. It's fascinating how just that one. It's fascinating that Twitter wasn't there to break that news.
It was very strange that he was away for so long. Then he comes back, and literally. I guess it was 3 weeks after the album comes out, he's gone. He's shot 3 weeks after he finally puts out a new album. And one of the things I bring out in the book, which I don't think a lot of people are aware of, is why he was in the studio that week working on Yoko's song. And I explain that in the book, which I don't think a lot of people know. He found out that a DJ at the Peppermint Lounge in New York, which was a hip dance club, that the DJ had played Yoko's sort of dance-like song, Kiss, 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 from the Double Fantasy album. And John thought that was freaking great. He said, wow, you're going to be a hit. You're going to be a dance artist. We got to put a record out of you, aimed at those discos and the clubs. And they had recorded the track or the makings of the track for Walking on Thin Ice back during the summer. And they said, let's finish that off. And that's going to go out to all the DJs and be like, it might have been in a little EP or something. Because I couldn't figure out why, you put out an album, but then you're back in the studio 2 weeks later. I mean, what's up with that? Why was that? But that was the reason behind it. He had heard that the DJ had played her song, Kiss, Kiss, Kiss. And he said, let's get back in the studio. And of course, that was what he was working on that night, the final mix of Walking on Thin Ice. And he plays just some great guitar. Like when people say, well, where would his music have gone? You put on Walking on Thin Ice. It sounds like a modern record. It really does. It doesn't sound like it's 40 years old.
Yeah.
He plays some really cool guitar on that.
Yeah, he's one of those artists. I always thought he was one of those artists who would, not necessarily the most, we began the show by talking about Eddie Van Halen. He's not that kind of virtuoso, but I think he even said, and I couldn't have described him any better, John Lennon, was that he plays that guitar. He's like, whatever, maybe not technically the best in the world, but I can make it scream or something like that. I might be getting the quote a little bit off.
Drive the band, I think he would say. He was a great rhythm player, and he could lay down the basis of the track, and then the other guys could fall in because they were so tight from playing together for so many years. They grew up, they're playing together since they were 16 or 17 or something, Yeah. But in doing research for the book, I read Mark. I'm not going to mess up his name, the great Beatle expert, begins with an L. His book, which is really a deep dive, it's 900 pages, and he only gets up to Lewis, his name. It only gets up to New Year's Eve 1962. So still got a long way to go. Yeah. But when you read about them, even in their early days, that John and Paul just complimented each other so much. John was loud, he was abrasive. He's one of these guys who I think Paul even said he had a tough exterior because he had been hurt so much by his mom dying and losing his mom, and he lost some other people in his life early. So he had a lot of rough edges. His big mouth would get them into trouble a lot of times. And he had a really mean sense of humor too. He'd cut people down, find your weak spot. That's why when they did the Ruddles movie with Eric Idle and all those guys, the John character was named Ron Nasty. He was kind of nasty sometimes, often. But Paul was the opposite. Paul was maybe not exactly the opposite. Paul was, of course, musical genius, but very self-confident, and sometimes to the point of arrogance. And nobody could talk to Paul, even his father, according to Mark Lewis' book. But John could. John would take him down a peg, and John would say, "That's a bunch of junk, that you're working on," and Paul would listen to him. So they really complemented each other. And from a musical standpoint, I think a lot of the way they collaborated, people don't realize. Just give you two examples. The piano on John gets a lot of credit for A Day in a Life, and deservedly so. But if you read some of the accounts of those recording sessions, Paul McCartney's playing that piano, which is so distinctive and adds so much to the song. And just one other example, the piano on While My Guitar Gently Weeps. I'm not trying to try to imitate it, but at the beginning it's like, that's Paul McCartney adding that to it, So he was really a good collaborator. And when they were all working together, it was all brilliant, the way they could complement each other and bring out the best in each other's material.
And I think I've heard Paul say that they were able to realize that in time, right? But before John was killed, they were able to realize how good of a team they were, I think, even with all the infighting, right?
Well, they were fighting over business, I think, I mean, and you know how that goes. When people start fighting over money, it gets ugly, and they had to work through that. But it took them quite a long time. Apparently, they had something of a rapprochement, in not too long before John died. But they were still sort of sniping back and forth, even in 1980 in their interviews. I don't know what it was like in private, but there was a lot of bad blood there for a long time, apparently.
Tim English, again, this has been great. John Lennon, when you try to sum him up really quickly, what did he mean to you in your life? Because it's obviously a lot more than just a favorite musician.
When he died, people, of course, talked about his great music, but they also talked about his humanitarian stuff, his peace, being about trying to, his peace campaign and anti-war stuff and things like that. I mean, they would speak about that almost as much as they did about his music. And, people forget that. I mean, if you listen to a song like Give Me Some Truth, that song is almost 50 years old. It's as relevant today as the day it was written. Listen to Power to the People, some of the things he talks about there. He says to the guys, he said, you're talking about all this stuff, but how are you treating your own woman at home? How do you treat her? You're telling everybody else what to do, but what are you doing yourself? Take a look in the mirror, and that's, again, it's as powerful a song today as it was back then. And so a lot of aspects of him, just brilliant guy, really the driving force behind the Beatles, and the guy who got it all together. If you read, they always would refer to John, Paul, George, and Ringo, and that was the order they entered the band too. John had his group, he got Paul got George, and then they all got Ringo, but mostly George got Ringo into the band. So one brought along another, in the chain, and it's brilliant results, obviously.
Obviously. All right. Well, Tim, real quickly, we're going to do some quick rapid fire. I always ask the show, first thing that comes to mind, this is how we end every show, all right?
Okay.
I hope you respect the Beatles.
Myself a little bit.
I got just for you, I got the Beatles mug on the show today.
Okay, cool.
There you go.
That logo, it was around from the early days. I don't know exactly when, but a long time.
Yeah. All right. Best concert you ever been to?
I saw Springsteen in the early days in a small theater. Capitol Theater, 1978, maybe. I don't know, one of those.
All right. That's a good answer.
70s. I'm dating myself.
He's my guy. That's a good one. All right.
By the way, John was a big fan of Hungry Heart. He liked that song a lot.
Did he really? I actually did not know that.
Yeah. You got to read the book.
That's very good. Yes. And again, the book is John Lennon, 1980 playlist. That's funny because Bruce wasn't really a huge fan of Hungry Heart. I believe that's one of the ones that was going to go in the trash can before manager John Landau said, no.
He got it. He wrote it for the Ramones. I think the Ramones said, why don't you give us a song? And so he's working on that. And Landau said, I don't think so. I don't want to give that one away.
Yeah, we're gonna
play quite a lot of other good ones like Does the Night and Fire and Small Things. Quite a lot of
there you go.
A lot of people's careers with his songs.
Yes,
our U.S. bonds.
Yes, absolutely. All right, favorite. So I asked your favorite show. What's your favorite venue? What's the best place to go see a show?
Um, there's, I'd say like a small theater where you're not all cramped in. There's one in Red Bank. That's one of the places I saw Springsteen long million years ago. You know, 1,200, 1,500 seat theater. You know, Monmouth Arts Center, Red Bank is a good one there, but there are plenty of other good ones.
Most fascinating musician you've ever met. I'm sure you've talked to as a music writer. I'm sure you've poked around and got a chance to meet a lot of people in this crazy business. Anybody jump out at you right off the bat?
Really haven't met that many that I can think of. I met songwriter Jimmy Webb at one time. He was fun to talk to. Just a brilliant guy and a nice guy too.
Jimmy Webb. All right, good answer. What's the? Let's go a little bit more general here. Favorite class back in the day in school?
uh,
How did you get here? This is going to help us.
I actually had one in college called The History of Jazz, which was very cool and very informative. So I'll go with that.
Favorite?
Most of the other schoolwork I wasn't a big fan of.
All right, plenty of people in the music business with that. What about favorite quarantine activity?
I guess just reading. You know, during the quarantine, I was researching and reading. Yeah, I guess I have to. I'm sorry, I can't have something more.
That makes a lot of sense for somebody who's releasing a book, I would say. I think that's probably good. And last but not least, are you thoughts on the music industry as a whole here? Because I know I have a lot of musicians on this show here, a lot of ones that are playing the clubs and the bars, and there's not a lot of work right now. I'm a little bit worried about these places when they reopen, and it's a tough spot to be in. Your thoughts on the music industry going forward post-pandemic, hopefully?
You know, a lot of people that are in bands, and I feel bad for them. Honestly, I mean, the pandemic is one thing, and God knows when you're getting out of that and when people will be able to go to shows. I mean, your guess is as good as mine, but it doesn't seem like it's happening anytime near term. But even before that, just that people have to be on the road to make money, that you can't make money with your music by selling records or CDs anymore. I mean, that's got to get fixed somehow, some way. I mean, just the way these streaming services compensate musicians or do not compensate them. And, you know, you have these guys to make a living. Even before the pandemic, you have to be riding around in a van with a bunch of guys out in the middle of nowhere, somewhere, going to a club where you're going to get minimally compensated. You may not have health insurance. You're risking yourself being out on a dark night in inclement conditions, maybe getting in an accident or something. I feel for these guys. I mean, they do it because they love it, but you should be able, hopefully, you know, to eke out some kind of living where at least you can support yourself. I was reading an article a few years ago about the band Grizzly Bear, and they were playing, I believe they were playing maybe a 1,500 seater up in Montreal, I believe it was. And they were talking about how those guys 20 years ago would all be multimillionaires. As it was, they were, you know, a couple of them were living at home, I think, and they weren't living large, to put it that way, for guys that were able to have reached that level of popularity that they did, for the reasons we're talking about. You know, they can't get compensated for their music. The only way they can make money is to be out on the road playing, and but people still do it. And you know, I guess if you're good enough, you can hopefully get compensated somewhere along the line. But it's hard now.
All right. Well, that's a good way we'll end it right there. Keep the musicians in mind as we go through the pandemic. Tim English, thank you so much for the time. The book is John Lennon 1980 Playlist. I'm guessing that is it right behind your head there, here in the, there it is.
And that photo is by a man named Alan Tannenbaum, if you can see that. And that was taken day before Thanksgiving, November 26, 1980, downtown in New York. And I just love the picture. I really think it captures. He sort of looks like he did in the Beatle days, but he's also much older and wiser and sager, I think, you know. So I was really glad I was able to get that photo for the cover.
Absolutely. Well, Tim, thanks for doing this, man. I really appreciate it. Another busy week in the music world. We touched on a lot of stuff, and I wish you all the best with the book.
Same to you, and thank you so much for having me on. It's been great talking to you.
All right, Tim.
Okay, cool.
All right, how about that? Very nice. Tim English, best of luck with the book there, sir. 80 years old, John Lennon would have been. Pretty incredible. And just another tough week here for the music world. Again, Eddie Van Halen passing away, and I don't know. It seems to be a lot of that. I was going to start to go down the list of musicians we've lost in 2020 during that interview, and I almost couldn't because it gets sad, and there's a lot of them. So, but again, Tim English, we wish you all the best. Of the book, John Lennon, 1980 playlist, seems like a must-have for all the big Beatles fans out there and music fans in general. Who's not a big Beatles fan? I'd like to meet you, talk to you. There you go. That sun looks nice coming through. I wonder if that's translating to the show. It's funny, as we turn the calendar and now we're getting into the fall, the whole dynamics of recording the show at this time of day are different. There's the sun in the kitchen. Very nice. Another fun week, guys. Thanks again to Tim English. My name is Drew Moholland. We'll see you next week, live from Drew's house. Bye-bye now.